session review. Just gonna continue right where we left last time. We covered table 3 pre-flop, that it's a tad too thin in solver land to open from the cutoff, but as remarked several times, I don't think it's that important to follow the solver pre-flop by the letter, and rather look at your table conditions and make your decisions basically in which direction you can expand your ranges pre-flop or should tighten up in certain spots, since the EV comes from all the post-flop play basically and not from the pre-flop decision, since the solver plays completely different post-flop. Not completely different, but we never copy the solver plays, so our EV comes more from the tendencies of our opponents. So we flop pretty nicely here with the open-ender flush draw, but it's a hand that's easily dominated. As soon as he has a higher flush draw, of course, our equity plummets. Him being a tight player, out of position, 3-betting, he will have a lot of double-suited high-card hands, so definitely want to proceed with caution here. Also, SPR is higher than 4, so we need even more equity to stack off. So when he stacks to us, I think it's a pretty good spot to just take the free card. We have very good playability on the low cards, basically, although our set of 7 should be good almost always. So apart from the flush draw and the straight outs, we still have that on our to go with. Obviously, if a 6 comes, we have great blockers plus still guaranteed equity. So our playability on a lot of turn cards is quite good, whereas the risk of getting check raised is definitely always out there, since players like to check raise like aces with the nut flush draw on this type of board to avoid ending the hand right now, instead of playing future streets, multiple streets out of position if they start betting here, knowing that a lot of turn cards will be troublesome, all the straight completing turn cards. And then even if it's something like ace, 9-9, 4 or something like just a random bare aces basically with the nut flush draw, then obviously also the high cards are the king, jack, 10, pairing queen. They're all not great, although quite difficult to play on. So even if he pots here with the set hand, although bare aces with a nut flush draw, the SPR is still pretty high, and then on a lot of turns, the equity, it becomes difficult to realize that equity, or the risk of running against many 2-pair plus if betting again, either getting it in on these turns that I mentioned, is quite high. So I'd say we can also check out the solver, actually, how the solver would play the spot from the buttons, big blinds spot. But I could definitely see a lot of bare aces with a nut flush draw going for a check raise here. And yeah, on the same token, obviously he will also have quite a bit of check calls with hands like ace, king jack with diamond, stuff like that. Like if I bet half pot here, he will just check call and then still have decent playability on a number of turns. Like he's kind of also playing the opposite game of ours. He's waiting for non-low cards that are the non-straight completing turn cards to continue with certain hands that has backdoor equity, whereas I try to get those cards. So let's check out the solver. As we can see here, it shows small blind against button instead of small blind against UTG, since I think the cutoff is closer to the button in that sense, and also with me having like a wide range there, or players in general. So I think it's more relevant to review that spot, where the in-position player has more of the low cards. And we see that aces with a nut flush draw are actually checking a considerable amount. Well, we see it's checking with only potting, considering potting with 3 hearts mainly. A bit of pot, although with the bare nut flush draw, the perfect nut flush draw, we see quite of a split between checking, half potting, and full potting. And with the backdoor flush draw included, it becomes much more of a half pot size thing. Like we know that pattern from 4-card PLO as well, where like the top of the range is kind of polar, half potting, trying to keep the opponent in, whereas the middle-ish section doesn't mind potting to lower the SPR, and prefers or doesn't mind a fold from the in-position player. So now, and if we see after out of position checks, first we're going to analyze, we see in-position stabbing 43%, and always only for half pot, never for full pot. And we see now that the aces with the nut hearts are check raising almost always. A little bit of slow playing apparently with the backdoor nut flush draw as well, but for the most part just check ripping. And we'll have a look now at after we clear that out, that there's definitely, what was the overall frequency of, so 18% check raises. Definitely we need to be careful that we don't bet merged here. We need to be polar, although in our spot now at the in-position player, and we don't want hands like the ones that I had. So if we make it, we have like, we see it's always checking back, definitely a hand that needs to pot control and maintain its equity basically. So far so good. And we see on table 4 actually nobody did have a trips plus, but they did have big straight draws both on the flop and then on the turn. As a side note, as a last reminder, I think it's still possible to bet this hand as an exploit if we know that there are a lot of players who are very merged straightforward, so they will always bet all the hands that allow aces with a flush draw here, and the checking range becomes quite vulnerable. So oftentimes check folding or at most check calling, but very rarely check raising. So against these players, obviously the EV goes highly up. If we almost never get raised off our equity, then we have an easy, our EV for playing aggressively with fold equity increases dramatically. Now he half pot size on the king turn, we pick up another gut shot. Easy call, no ways about it. Now we hit the low flush. Kind of not ideal, obviously. And he half pots this. I feel like, against half pot, we just have to call every flush. Not loving it, of course, since, like mentioned before, players under bluff and tight players heavy in the double suited hand class. And if they're double suited, high chance of having, then betting the turn here and betting the river. When players under bluff, they just don't have enough, but giving that there's still a chance that he's doing, especially against full pot, I would be more prone to fold, since players are just even less likely to bluff and it's just extracting more value. Whereas there's still we only need to be good 25% of the time, and there's still a chance that he has some kind of bear ace or bear king of clubs blocker that he bluffs with, that he is bluffing with a one pair hand. But unfortunately, he did have a hand that makes perfect sense for not betting the flop. And then on the turn, he has little to worry about. So it's more about keeping me in with having all the nutted straight draws, except for the low straight draw, obviously. But And then on the river, the same applies. He tries to extract value from my weak flushes and potential low straights. Table 2, definitely, as we learned, I'm not going to pop it up in the solver, but it's clear that the 3 dangler and being double triple suited on top of that is definitely killing the value of the hand. So I am only opening it here because the button is so tight over the sample, the session stats we have. So, and all the other players also, there's more chance of taking this down pre-flop and less risk of getting 3-bet, but it's definitely too loose. The 3 dangler, like it needs to be at least a 6, I'd say, to make it an open. Yeah, definitely table 3, even against recreational player, important to fold these types of hands. Single suited, ace high, like low card, semi-connected. It's just not enough playability, not enough profitable post-flop spots to justify playing these hands out of position. Like they're basically just big blind against small blind calls. Table 2 is interesting. I would say like that the solver would fold plenty of these hands out of given the non-nutted characters, and as we talked before, although having a dangler this time, like an overcard dangler, the low suits and whatnot. But down on the other token, we're in the big blind, so that's obviously a spot where we get away with more calls than any other position completing the action. So let's check the solver. And as we can see, surprisingly, this hand is a call double suited in all its variants, even with the 2 low suits, double, triple, you name it. Like all double suited are basically calling. I mean, there are also, some hands are mixed, so it's not completely clear, but when we see the EV is pretty close to 0 EV or 0.9 instead of folding for 1.0. But it's still important that the solver does consider playing these hands, and probably let's see how close it is. Yeah, we see even with the 7-5 gap, it's still calling some hands, but sure enough, as soon as we drop one more down, as soon as we add a deuce to the equation, it becomes a fold. 6-5-4 deuce actually still is playable. Like now we have the 6-5-4, which is quite valuable compared to like the 6-4-3 deuce, for example. So yeah, quite these hands again. I would say, as a rule of thumb, if one recreational player is involved, definitely we want to call. If it's 2 kind of aggressive regulars, I wouldn't mind folding these type of hands. Let's see how close the difference is. Yeah, although having a 4-card rundown obviously changes a lot, but having also here now a jack instead of a queen definitely drops the calls. And yeah, having like I think the 7-6 connectivity is more important. But yeah, we see all these they're all hovering around the same 0 EV gap, or not gap, zone basically. So yeah, we can go either way. Let's see if we have like pure low cards, for example. Yeah, although with 1 gap, it's quite easy to call, whereas if we have 2 gaps, especially with a deuce, becomes more of a fold than if we go a little bit higher. Yeah, so here the 2 gaps definitely can be called quite widely as soon as we don't have a deuce in our hand, or as long as we don't have a deuce in our hand. Let's see if we have like the 2 gaps together. Yeah, that's definitely much worse. It's now we have much reduced straight draw combinations, but yeah, two gaps between the 5-card rundown is definitely playable. So let's go on. Bear bottom straight, definitely just check calling. Not even say definitely check calling against a big bet from the imposition player. I could see myself just folding, since, as we all know from regular PLO, bear bottom straight on a dynamic board it's never improving, and if our opponent doesn't have us beat already, then he has a strong combo draw, like grab, flush draw, 2-pair, whatever's on the board, basically, you name it. So when we can't call down on blanks, and there are very few blanks anyways, and we can't continue against further aggression on all the board changing cards, we might as well just check fold the flop. But luckily he checks back. And at that point now, I think it's a pretty good spot to protection bet. We should get a lot of folds there, since now also hands with equity, like overpair with flush draw, has to worry about being already up against a boat. So we're going to get a lot of folds, and that's a great outcome, of course, for our hand. Table number 1, flopping the nut straight. I think there was a little hiccup in the footage. So basically he block C bets, and I decide to raise it up. Normally, I'm not a big fan of raising nut straights without additional equity or without redraw, since there's always the risk of getting bet 3-bet and then running out, getting free rolled basically. But I think in this spot, I like to make an exception, since the small blind will probably range c-bet that board, and he will have plenty. We unblock all the board pairs, so there's his range is higher weighted towards sets that we want to protect against. So I think this is a spot where I like to raise a little bit more aggressively with bare nut straights. Us being in position and the high chance, although like I said, since the board is rainbow, if he bets 3-bets, it's a high chance that he has a set or 2 pairs to go with, and then probably by 2 pair I mean top 2 for the most part. So we can easily call the 3-bet, and then if he continues betting on board pairs, we just have an easy fold. Whereas on the same token, we just probably just get to showdown on board pairing turns or rivers, since there's little value to be extracted, and not having a single blocker to the board, obviously doesn't entice me to try to get him to fold a chop. But the main point basically is that we don't have that tough of a time on rainbow boards when facing a bet 3-bet, and we have the blocker that now comes into play, the club blocker, which is obviously also a nice additional piece of our hand. And I definitely want to continue betting here, drawing don't letting sets to draw for the right price. And if he picked up a flush draw, definitely also want to charge him, so betting quite big here. My main bluffs obviously would be centered around 10-10, like 10-10 with a Broadway pair to have that open ender, but on the same token reducing drastically his straight combos. Table 3, not much to talk about, obviously weak hand, no need to... I defended big blind against small blind, no need to bet on that flop. And we're probably just gonna check it down. Interesting to note that he just checks down his air, although effectively air, he has a pair of deuces. That I think he has... I do agree with flop and turn play, since it's just very marginal, non-nutted apart from the gut shot. But I think he has a very clear river bluff. It's just having the bottom pair is a great asset to turn into a bluff, to reduce just some on this in general. On this turn, on this river card, obviously it's much more centered around trips or higher pocket pairs, like blocking probably 10 or 9 are great. But I think it's a great spot, since he will have in a small blind range plenty of aces, kings, queens, bear, jack, X that all didn't want to bet flop or turn. But now he has a great spot to get value with those, so he can bluff very liberately or very lightly. And him having all these assets, like I mentioned, he has an ace blocker, a queen blocker, a 9 blocker, and a deuce blocker. So definitely he should bluff here. I think half pot size is a fine sizing just to get me to fold hands like mine, since I can't really profitably bluff catch here, knowing that how often he has value. Further kind of still gives a very valuable read that he doesn't go for these bluffs. So in the future, we can definitely assume that he's under bluffing in a lot of other spots as well. So we give more credit to his bets, and maybe the next time in that spot where I called him down in that 3-bet pot with my low flush, I could just fold the river there, knowing that he's probably under bluffing. Table 1, pretty standard, double suited aces, and I'd say in 4-card PLO there's more merit in block c-betting, but in 5-card PLO with the I prefer to half pot size even on these dry ace-king high rainbow boards, just because there's much more queen jack 10 out there, there's more kings and more ace-king available, so we kind of want to start polarizing / protecting our hand on this board where we crush, where we have this big aces advantage. And yeah, we have very poor playability, obviously, in terms of backdoors. So this one of the better turn cards. Apart from obviously a lot of other blank turn cards, but giving us additional equity there. But with that SPR and us unblocking the ace of spades and the king of spades, obviously, so definitely want to pot here. Don't think it's a good spot to continue betting like half pot or block or checking or whatnot. It's a spot where he's not gonna, if the read on him that he's rather like a tight passive player, there's a good chance he's just gonna check back almost his entire range. So I definitely want to pot here for the cases he does have something like ace queen jack of spades, and it's actually pretty close to being a call, although getting the right odds to call even against pot size. So definitely no reason to go any smaller. I think table 3 is a pretty clear opener. We'll check that out in the solver again, since I think it's kind of useful just to know how to navigate. We don't, again, not to sound like a dead horse, but to beaten that horse to always repeat the same. But we don't have to stick to the solver play, but it's still good to know in what way it's deviating, or where are the thresholds basically, and then we can still cross these thresholds easily, but at least we know how close it is. So we were in the cutoff effectively with ace queen 8-8-4, and we see the solvers opening even the single suited versions of this hand. So definitely strong points. Although if we give like relevancy to the preflop holdings, like ace high suit, high cards, and a pocket pair are definitely high in the solver's favor. So let's see if we change the 4 to a 3, so less connectivity there. Still, now it's only double suited versions, and the 3 or the deuce don't make a change, but it's definitely all ace queen 8-8 combos are in open, basically double suited from the cutoff. Probably if we go back to middle position, and it's a fold, and with a deuce, with a 3 it becomes kind of marginal, and then with a 4 again all double suited. Well, only without the trip without ace high suit double suit, and the EV is quite marginal as we see, but it's definitely a fine open from since I have here the ace high suit, which is far more relevant than having the queen high heart suit, I'd say, and the solver also would argue so. So definitely fine open even from middle position. And obviously an easy overcall there. It's a board my cutoff range sometimes hits. If I had to guess, I have the most straights on this board, since if players would play their ranges correctly, which they don't, but still we should assume that a button is heavy on aces and high rundowns, and small blind should also be pretty heavy in mid-high rundowns, not so much the low rundowns. But then again, a lot of players overvalue these low rundowns and will still play them or cold call them. Me having here the 8 blockers obviously is pretty important, even though they're not immediate straight blockers. They block a lot of 8-7-6 combos that are much more likely to get played than like 7-6, 5-4 combos, let's say. So it could become relevant at a later stage, but I think not having any relevant equity apart from that low gut shot and the board pair, not even a backdoor flush draw, I think it's definitely too loose to stab. Like, we have better versions of this hand or similar hands that could start bluffing, like stabbing like half pot or even third pot to apply pressure throughout the streets, basically. Although putting probably the most likely outcome, if we bet small here, then we get called. a lot by like flush draw, but then on non-flush completing turns, we can continue betting, like even though the SPR is low. Like if we bet 60 like he did, and one, like let's say the imposition player calls, so there's 180 plus 120, so that's 300 with like 380 behind. So even though the SPR doesn't look great, but I still think these are spots like where a big bet, like a big bet fold, I think pot is maybe not necessary, maybe like 2/3 to 3/4 is a great sizing to get these nut flush draws to fold. But obviously once they both put in money, I'm out of there. And table 1, I check back my air. The flop, beautiful hand pre-flop, but unfortunately not great board. And now on the turn, even though we do improve, when he pots out, I just fold. I think it's important to, we can't rely on all our 2-pair outs to be clean. And he is the tight player so far that we've seen. Like he has never been bluffing, so very high chance that he has a strong hand here of any sorts. So important to not overvalue bare top pair hands in these spots. But then again, it depends on the player. If he would be a very, like you have a lot of players who kind of probe a very high frequency, like very aggressively, then of course, if we know he has a lot of like very marginal hand, like second pair with a bare open ender, stuff like that, in this case, our equity becomes much better and we can easily call down on whenever we hit 2 pairs, basically. Table 2, I'd say the solver would call this hand, but in a 100 big blind scenario, but with that very aggressive big blind who is likely to squeeze at a very high frequency, my hand really, like if he squeezes, then probably the open raiser is going to 4-bet lightly and we have to fold. So yeah, and also the hand kind of, yeah, it can call a squeeze, like if we are closing the action, but like I said, 100 big blinds I'd call it, but with that aggressive but big blind, I definitely have to tighten up here. That's why I just folded. Table 3, a hand. If we have our mental checklist that we were working on, like for pre-flop questions, we have ace high suit check, high cards check, connectivity check, playability. The 5th card also somewhat still connected to the rest check. So I'd say it fits the requirements to call here. We have that recreational player who limped or posted, not sure. But anyways, he's very likely to just call along. So our hand, even though we would prefer to have higher suits, better connectivity, I'd still think it's profitable with the recreational player involved. But obviously not strong enough to 3-bet, since the requirements for 3-betting are much higher in 5-card pillow. I think this board is decent, and also with my hand, like I would, again, obviously prefer to have a 7 or 6 blocker, but still I think it's nice to bet for protection here. This board, even though the recreational player has a wide range, he still just has a lot of random hands that I have to fold. And the preflop raiser obviously should be centered around high cards. So I have a lot of fold equity on the flop. And even if I get called, I have 2 backdoor flush draws. I have nut boat potential, so on and so forth. So definitely think it's a decent spot. I go for the small size, which is, I think, yeah, half pot sometimes has that benefit of having like just a few % extra fold equity from a hand, like a gut shot with an overpair, stuff like that may fold against half pot, but will peel against that sizing. But then again, it still does the job of denying equity to all the bare overpairs, overcards and whatnot. So I think both sizings are fine. Like for the smaller sizing, we can bet a little bit more merged, I'd say, whereas for the bigger we go, the more kind of polar we become. Table 1, in position, like no short stacks left to act. I think it's a fine call, even though the 2 obviously hurts our hand quite a bit. And table 3, after both players call, I'm a bit not concerned, but alarmed, let's say, that my hand is maybe not good. Now also a couple of more straights got there. and it's a great hand. With hitting the backdoor, the flush, not flush draw, it's obviously great in terms of guaranteed equity that I can easily check call any bet. I think even pot size we can call if we plan on bluffing also on a 4 and a 3. We have like these ghost outs, as I like to call them, apart from all our regular outs. So I think, against the sizing I could easily call. But unfortunately, the one scenario where we can't continue is when cutoff overjams. So now we can't count on all our outs being clean. As mentioned before, quite likely that at least one of there can be sets, 2 pairs, flush draws, nut straights. Everything is out there basically. So we definitely have to discount a couple of our outs, and we don't have to, given paying 430 to win 670. So our odds are obviously much worse than in other situations. So we need to fold there. And table 1, I decide to stab there against 2 players. Having a board pair close to the 5 is nice in terms of reducing, like blocking their rundowns that include a 5. Having a backdoor flush draw, not flush draw, definitely helps. So I think these spots are great to attack since they don't have to work that often and become highly profitable. Stab there with the right types of hands. And we can see, table 3, so there was a set and a flush draw up against the bare nut straight. Table 1 is interesting. I'd say these hands, they're always a bit difficult, I'd say, to play double suited, but non-nut suit. We'll check how the solver approaches these spots. Just quickly, table 4, I defended the big blind against the middle position from a recreational player open. And I decided to go for the check raise here instead of the lead. I'd say the recreational players, they are more prone to bet, especially if they're already kind of shallow. We can't generalize it. A lot of recreational players are also super passive and are not prone to bet. But let's say, I don't know how many hands it is, but if somebody plays 100% VPIP, oftentimes they're coming to gamble basically. And my hand, obviously can go either way, but check raising is nice to end the hand, to push our big edge on the flop and not wait for, if we lead out and get called, sure, we can still stack off on most turns, but it's not that, like on a jack or queen or an ace turn, obviously it becomes a bit more iffy. But anyway, either way is fine. I'd say let's check out the pre-flop spot here, cutoff opening range with these type of hands. So to my surprise, the solver opens all of them, just folding the 5 of a suit. But that means even 4 low suits are unopened. So here we see again that the connectivity we don't see it again, but in this case we see definitely that the solver really values the connectivity and having an ace, so he opens all of them, and definitely the EV is quite high. We see once we go down to the non-nutted suit, non-nutted double suit, where do we have them? Here, the EV is still reasonable. And I think in our case, did we have doubles? Yeah, we were double suited, so it's definitely a clear open. And let's see how quickly that drops. Even if there's a 2 gap, like just the 10-9-8 combo seems to be very strong. That having the 5 dangler, it's still opening mostly. But now obviously we drop the weaker ones, like the single suited non-nut suits. Here we see even now, since the 4, 5, 4, 3, since they all add to the ace connectivity, there's still a lot of them are playable. We see once we go down to the deuce, that's where he starts, or even at the 3 already. needs to be a nut suit at that point. But any nut suit is fine. Whereas with the 4 side card, it's the last one where still like double suited, non-nut suit are still playable, but not the weakest word. But as we saw, as soon as we have that playability, the connectivity with the 6 or higher, it becomes a pure open with all suits. Yeah, and table 4, after I check raise, pot on the flop and get called, obviously a great spot to, no need to bet on the turn with that low SPR. We just let him, give him some rope to hang himself, as he does with bear top 2 or well 3 pair on the turn, in all fairness. Table 1, against small blind range, not really, even though he is loose aggressive, but we see also throughout the parts, I think in previous parts his VPIP session stat was around 45 to 50, whereas now it's dropping down to 37. So sometimes it's also the sample size, or like, since you never have these really accurate data on GG poker, so he becomes more and more quote unquote reasonable in terms of the ranges he plays. So we should be more concerned that obviously this board hits a small blind calling range pretty hard. So it's not a spot where we want to see that lightly on. And then turn, not picking up any equity. Same story. Table number 3, SPR close to 1, nut gutter, backdoor flush draw against a wide range. It's pretty close. I'd say we don't make a mistake to check fold or to bet, get it in. I decided to check here, hoping for a free card. Obviously, that would be the ideal situation, but when he insta pots, I'm up against. Sure, he can have some bluffs, but me blocking the high straight draws, so he's very likely to have at least like a jack with an 8 or a 9. But oftentimes he also has just something very strong, like 2 pairs plus. So I think we definitely want to check fold at that spot. Like, players don't insta-pot bluff, basically, without equity. So against this overall range, I'm just not doing great. Yeah, all opens pretty standard, nothing to analyze there, or the call on table 1. Just check calling the flop is the plan. I think it's not a hand that I want to include in my donking range. Like, I will have donks on this board, but my hand really doesn't benefit from building a pot out of position over multiple streets, but it has an easy check call and a bit of playability, backdoor playability. Once he checks back, I think it's a good spot now to probe the turn, because he obviously kept his range, so he's less high in high flush draws, big straight draws that made a straight now, or two pair top 2 combinations and stuff like that. So I think it's a decent spot now that also my kings become relevant blockers to block king jack and the king high flush draw. So I think it's a pretty decent spot to fold out bare aces. And table number 2, with that low SPR against a very loose aggressive player, I think it's good to start betting for value. And now on the turn, I could continue betting, like to charge his flush draws, but I think it's also a good spot to check back and bluff catch rivers, since we only have to worry about hearts, basically. Anything else, we got it covered. And protecting against like 20%-ish of a flush draw, I think is less worse than inducing a bluff, which from an aggressive player will very often come. He insta-pots. It's obviously never great, but I gotta stick to my plan there. That quickly checking, I see a river bluffy donk. And unfortunately, this time he has the Uber nuts that he decided to slow play, and Yeah, it's important to keep in mind that even aggressive players, they can be tricky, but that insta-pot river bet oftentimes looks for value. I mean, some players do it as a bluff as well, like they just act very quickly all the time, but it can be often a clue, like players are just so impatient to mash the pot button with the nuts that they kind of give away a bit of a timing tell, and they're often also more prone to bet smaller as a bluff. It's just a typical psychological effect that players want to risk less the time they are bluffing, and they want to try to maximize the times they know they have the nuts. Yeah. Table 4, pretty weak queens, I think, this time. I think we analyzed that before when we had the queen 9-8-6, where we stated that we needed to be double suited of any kind. This time we are double suited, but the connectivity is much worse with the 6-3 instead of the 3 not being an 8. So I think it's clear fold against a tight button range. And yeah, table 1, I overcalled, pretty classic. We definitely don't want to 3-bet or squeeze without having an ace in our hand almost ever. And the hand plays perfectly fine, multi-way in position. On the flop, I could have stepped, but without a diamond, I felt like it's just a tad too weak. And also having the gut shot or blocker with a 6 instead of an 8 unblocks a lot of hands that can continue in their ranges, like Jack 10-8 combos, stuff like that. So I just don't have enough fold equity and equity basically to use this hand as a bluff. And obviously we also have showdown value and some good turn cards are hitting a backdoor flush draw, hitting a 9, hitting the straight, hitting a queen. So definitely clear check back candidate. Table 2, opening the small blind and c-betting the flop, looks pretty standard. And table number 4 is actually a clear defend. Almost all, I reviewed that spot earlier in Solver. So any king, queen, queen basically is a defend from the big blind against the button open. By any, I mean maybe excluding the very worst versions, but a great hand, but it's still definitely worth playing there against the button open.